Ladies and gentlemen, I love talking about Canada. And why? Because I am a Canadian, despite the fact that I live in Austria right now. So History Matters, one of my favorite content creators, he has made quite a bit of Canadian YouTube content, still has to do with history, so we're going to watch 3 of those videos today. First one is, why didn't France try to retake Quebec? Just a good question. Never even thought of it myself. The Canadian Revolution explained. Yes, the Canadian Revolution explained. And why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? So we're going to start first off with, why didn't France try to take Quebec? Full disclosure, I am from Ontario. I am not a native French speaker. I learned French in school for 6 years. I can barely speak French, though. I speak much better German than I do French. So yeah, without further ado, let's get right into it.
Quebec is well known as the French-speaking part of Canada. But
Oui, oui.
before it was a part of the land of Maple Leaf, it was a part of British North America, and before that, New France. Hence
Yes.
its settlement in the 17th century by French speakers who became the Quebecois of today. But given the former British control and their past animosity with the French, why didn't France ever try to retake Quebec for itself? Why did they just leave it to their rival? So France controlled Quebec from its first settlement there in the early 17th century to 1763. And this was the year that France accepted defeat in the 7 Years' War, named so because it lasted for 9 years. As a result...
Shocking. So yeah, I'm just gonna make a prediction and say that the short answer is because they couldn't. That's what I'm going to guess the short answer of this is.
Of that defeat, Britain took all of France's land east of the Mississippi, in order to consolidate its control over North America and give its loyal colonists there, who were loyal, room to expand westward. Some stuff happened, and it wasn't long until British North America saw a rebellion which led to the creation of the United States of America.
We'll get to that video.
During the American Revolutionary War, the French got involved, and given Britain's defeat in 1783, why didn't they try to regain their lost land from 20 years prior? Well, there were several reasons. The first was that occupying territory made it much easier to claim, and Britain still held Quebec.
And this is the main thing too. And like looking at
The first was that occupying territory made it much easier to claim, and Britain still...
Right, I mean, look at the sheer size of this, right? To try and, I mean, you only have to find a few strategic cities, but it's also incredibly expensive to hold on to this territory, right? And I'd imagine with the threats as well that France really just wasn't interested in trying to take this territory, as well as the 2 other reasons, which we'll see in a moment. But it's just crazy to think how large the British Empire was during this period. Just absolutely massive, conquering most of North America, obviously until the Americans themselves split off. So it's, wow, just crazy to think how large the British Empire really was at its peak.
Still held Quebec. And also, in a war that doesn't end in one side's occupation, you can't demand everything. And what France had pushed to gain was Tobago, because sugar plantations make all of the money, unlike Quebec, which just exported fur. The second reason was that France had largely got what it wanted, and that it wanted to aid the US to make Britain economically weaker, and that had been achieved. There was no sense in pushing too hard and forcing Britain to keep fighting, which would have been expensive. Which brings us to the third
Keyword,
reason,
as I said, right?
Money.
Yep, and that's what it always comes down to. It always comes down to wars are incredibly expensive. Holding on to territory is incredibly expensive. And right after key wars, right, like the 7 Years' War, or which took 9 years, or multiple other European wars, the countries end up completely broke, right? And so trying to capture more colonial power, yeah, not always the greatest idea.
It was mostly broke at this point, and re-establishing imperial control over a colony that wasn't very lucrative in the first place was quite expensive. So what about after this? As you'll know, the American Revolution wasn't Britain and France's last war, since the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleoning of Europe meant that there was plenty of war to be had. France, however, despite Napoleon's many victories, wasn't in a position to invade North America because the Royal Navy was blocking the way, and also Napoleon didn't want to upset the United States. And so, with this knowledge, better plan.
Actually, I have an interesting question. What was the relationship between Napoleon and the United States? Maybe that's something you guys could tell me in the comments, actually, because I'm not entirely sure on that part of history, to be honest.
Louisiana to them and used the money to fight and defeat as many enemies. And after Napoleon's eventual defeat, there was no more wars between Britain and France, so gaining Quebec that way wouldn't be possible. Furthermore, as time went on, Quebecois and French culture diverged and the connection between the two became weaker. For example, during World War I, the Quebecois opposed conscription since they had no loyalty to either the British Empire or their French ally. And as a result...
And this is one thing that really was actually a massive divisive issue in Canada, was over the French conscription. And there were many riots and there was a lot of tension built around this. And obviously there was separatism for Quebec, and this went on for many years. I mean, up until the 1990s, Quebec tried to separate from Canada. I think that the most recent referendum was in the 1990s, and it was something like 51% wanted to stay. It was incredibly close. And so this divisive issue of Quebec really trying to be a separate nation is something that continued on, and as was stated here, is it becomes less French, more, oh, we want to join France, rather Quebec is a separate nation that is not sort of a part of Canada, but rather an individual nation state, so to say, that seeks independence from the rest of Canada. It isn't just like, oh, we want to be the new, province of France. No, they want to be a separate, unique nation. So
for time, both sides ceased to see each other as the same people, but as sort of cousins. That's not to say that France had no interest in the area. In the 1960s, independence for Quebec became a major political issue in Canada, and the French followed it closely.
There we go.
Infamously, this period saw French President Charles de Gaulle shout, "Long live a free Quebec," during his visit to Montreal.
Yes.
This, shockingly, caused a diplomatic incident, and de Gaulle immediately left for France. After this, most French leaders took the position of not officially taking a stance, but closely following Quebec independence movements. But that said, despite taking an interest, there was zero desire for Quebec to join France on both sides. Too much time had passed, and France had missed her chance. I hope.
And so that was a great summary between the Quebec independence wanting to, like I said, become its own nation, not just wanting to be a part of France. I think that's really commonly confused. And I mean, Quebecois French is so different than Parisian French as well. And there's lots of cultural things that are uniquely Quebecois. So yeah, that was a great little video. So now let's go a little bit back in time and let's look at the Canadian Revolution as explained by History Matters. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Canadian Revolution explained quickly by History Matters. So we tackled Quebec a little bit. Let's look at the whole country and go back a little bit in time.
Canada has always had a reputation as being the well-behaved British colony. Whilst it...
Well, maybe well-behaved than the other ones, so to say.
Southern neighbour rebelled and broke free, the British Northern Territory stayed loyal and wanted nothing to do with it. Yet Canada, like so many other territories of the British Empire, did have its own armed revolution, which will be a surprise to many.
Yes, the Upper Canada
didn't really exist at this point. It was actually a series of British colonies. The two important ones were Upper Canada, capital Toronto, and to its north, Lower Canada, focused on Montreal and being host to a majority French-speaking population. Throughout the early 19th century, the people of these two Canadas had wished for wide sweeping reforms to the colonies. And the answer...
Yeah, because the main thing is that they were not represented in the way that Canada currently is. They were obviously, they were sort of autocratic in their own manner, right? They were not exactly, how would you put it? Yeah, they didn't have a democratically elected parliament. Their representatives were sort of autocrats that sort of ruled over the Canadian working class. So, it's kind of surprising that, and we'll get to that in the next video, that that they didn't try and join America in any sort of way, right? When the American Revolution broke out, that, obviously a lot of them were monarchists and they were more loyal to the crown than they were loyal to these sort of autocrats that led them.
The answer, in case you were wondering, was no. This was because both of the Canadas were run by closed-off, anti-democratic oligarchic collectives. In Lower Canada, it was the Chateau clique, made up of mostly Englishmen who wanted the French speakers there to integrate to an English way of life, which, in case you're wondering, did not endear them to the population.
And would piss off the rest of the French quite significantly, and this is sort of a running theme between English and French relations in Canada, is that the English try and, what would you say? Make the French speak English, and it never goes well.
In Upper Canada, it was the family compact in charge, and it was also hostile to democracy. These groups obviously had their critics. In Upper Canada, the primary critic was William Lyon Mackenzie, who led
okay. And he is the grandfather of Sir William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was the longest serving Prime Minister of Canada. He led Canada throughout the Second World War, throughout a part of the Great Depression. The other Prime Minister during that time was R.B. Bennett, who was very unpopular. And so even though Mackenzie King lost to R.B. Bennett, he replaced him afterwards. And William Lyon Mackenzie was also the first mayor of Toronto, otherwise known as Toronto for anyone who actually lives in Toronto. and Toronto to people who do not. So that's a tiny little Canadian accent fun fact for you.
The Reform movement. And in Lower Canada, it was Louis-Joseph Papineau, the leader of a group called the Patriots.
I think Papineau is the riding where Justin Trudeau is. In
1832, after some protesters in Montreal were shot by Crown soldiers, Papineau sent a list of demands to the British government in order to reform the colony. Britain and the Lower Canadian leaders decided that they weren't going to launch any reforms and that actually everything was perfect already. And over the next 5 years, tensions continued to rise and the deadlock continued. In November 1837, things started to turn a bit radical and the Lower Canadian government attempted to arrest Papineau. He fled south to the United States and his supporters began to violently resist government attempts to round people up. The government wasn't able to suppress this quickly and it soon turned into a full-scale revolt against British rule. In Upper Canada, seeing their neighbours revolt there in full swing, Mackenzie and his followers followed suit and began their own uprising. They did well at first because the troops there had been moved out of the province, but the revolutionaries had one major issue. They weren't professional soldiers. This didn't stop Mackenzie from declaring the creation of the Republic of Canada, which then promptly collapsed as the revolutionaries were defeated by local militiamen. You would assume that that was it then for the Canadian Revolution, but fun fact, no. The rebellion had garnered a great deal of interest in the United States, and many there were sympathetic to the Canadians' plight. Some Americans formed groups which welcomed Mackenzie and Papineau and sought to help them in making Canada a republic. This eventually led to a group of American volunteers called the Hunter Brothers crossing the border and invading Canada. And it wasn't long before British troops killed Americans, which inflamed tensions.
Yeah, and that's the main thing, in that there was obviously issues of the British Crown being concerned about the Americans, right, invading Canada proper, right, and not just having a few members, so to say, sort of guns for hire, if you will, and though they obviously weren't paid, coming into Canada and fighting against the Crown, right, and there was really a great deal of concern for this exact issue. So.
Now, obviously, armed American citizens invading Canada was a cause for concern in both London and Washington, who didn't want war. In the end, both sides came to an agreement to suppress Americans crossing the border, and in Canada itself, the Lower Canadian Rebellion had been completely crushed by the end of 1838. So what did this mean for Canada and the rebels? Well, Britain wanted to prevent a rebellion from happening again, and so it tasked Lord Durham to make a list of recommendations.
Yes, 1840.
The first and the only one that was initially followed was the unification of the Canadas into just one Canada. And as for the leaders of the rebellion, they remained in exile in the USA. Eventually, though, they were pardoned and returned to Canada. And so, the Canadian Revolution was over, and whilst it didn't create an independent Canadian Republic, it did, to a certain extent, create Canada.
Yes, and that was the main thing, is that the B&A Act of 1840 was sort of the pretext to the B&A Act of 1867, which created Canada, right? Which is sort of our founding document, so to say, is the British North America Act of 1867. That was under sort of the leadership, if you will, of John A. Macdonald, and was considered a bloodless revolution, right? One that was done through diplomacy and not through guns, and sort of fighting, not with weapons and fighting against the British monarchy, but rather through diplomacy and through creating acts and creating this 1867 document. I think it's quite interesting because it's one of the things that we parallel against the United States. So the United States obviously had an armed revolution against the British Crown. However, Canada was done diplomatically and through drink and not blood. I think that's one of the phrases that's sort of thrown around for that. So with all that being said, and now we learned about the Canadian Revolution, the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1840 is another word for it. Let's find out, why did America not attack Canada and try and free them from our British overlords? Let's find that out. Okay, last video here. Why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? A question maybe some of you have pondered, one that I've asked myself. Let's just get straight into it.
When the American War for Independence broke out, 13 of Britain's North American colonies opted to sever ties with the mother country. However, some of those colonies chose to remain loyal and afterwards would go on to form the Dominion of Canada. Thus the question is, why did...
Well, many years later, right? Many years later that happened. That was not something that was just like, oh yeah, and 5 years later Canada was formed. No, this was a few, I think it was a century later, that Canada was formed in 1867 and didn't look as modern day Canada until Newfoundland joined in, I believe, 1949. So that was mostly correct, but the way it was represented, it wasn't just, 5 years later, Canada was formed. No, it took a much longer time than that.
Canada joined the American Revolution. Before continuing, it's important to stress that in 1775, Canada didn't exist. It was instead comprised of the colonies of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Rupert's Land, and St. John's Island. Barring Quebec, the differences between the peoples of these states and those of the 13 colonies were no more or less stark. Before it can be determined why all of the colonies didn't leave, it's necessary to know why the 13 that did leave chose to break away in the first place. Much of the anger directed at Britain was due to the idea that the recent acts of King George III and his parliament violated the rights of Englishmen. This is why the province of Quebec had no interest in revolting, since, it wasn't English. Speaking of Quebec, it was itself one of the reasons for the revolution. The Quebec Act had expanded the size of the French-speaking colony and granted freedom of religion there, which to the Protestant English-speaking colonies surrounding them was terrible. For Quebec,
always comes down to religion,
stay
doesn't
with
it?
Britain, whom they didn't exactly like,
Religion
but
and
granted
money.
them rights and more territory, or to the rebels who despised them. But what about when the French began to help the Americans? Didn't Quebec want to go back to being under French rule? Well, no. Being a British colony gave Quebec access to a much larger international trading market, and also, to put it bluntly, the French didn't really care about it anymore. Another reason for the American Rebellion is what are known as the Intolerable Acts. Things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the Quartering Act took away rights and privileges that American colonists had previously held, which shockingly upset them. The taxes that Britain imposed were done so without the consent of the Americans, leading to cries of no taxation
without representation. Yes, the famous phrase that is still used to this day, I suppose, with sort of, what would you say, libertarian types, I suppose, in some sort of way. No taxation without representation. It's quite a beautiful phrase, actually, if I do say so myself.
Representation, to which Britain's response was, the people living in Britain itself barely have representation, so what makes you say so? Also, mass financial problems across the colonies, combined with the ban on expanding westward in order to prevent war with the Indians, meant that revolution wasn't too far away. Some of these acts, combined with economic issues, negatively affected the peoples of the later Canadian colonies just as badly. Unlike the 13 colonies, though, the reaction wasn't quite as fierce there. In places like Rupert's Land and St. John's Island, the acts weren't quite as important, since their economies relied on natural resource extraction. Whereas in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, the acts were just as disruptive. These colonies did see some resistance to British policies. Nova Scotia had close ties to New England, and much of its population were immigrants from there. Thus, they too were angry at the new taxes, and this anger culminated in a couple of riots, but ultimately no more than that. Much of this was down to the province being much less urbanised, and so what little resistance there was couldn't be organised quickly. Nova Scotia's economy was also reliant on the British military, since Halifax was a garrison town which played host to many Royal Navy vessels. Another factor which secured their allegiance was that British troops were needed to fight off Indian raiding. Speaking of which, raiding by American privateers during the war drastically soured the relationship between Nova Scotia and the 13 rebelling colonies.
I see, and and then it went down from there, and then they were more affirming to the British Crown. Interesting.
That Nova Scotia would remain loyal to Britain. As for Newfoundland, many of its residents were fishermen who had either relocated from Britain recently or were there for a season to work, and thus inclusion in the British Empire was necessary for their livelihoods. Whilst Newfoundland had many problems similar to those in the American colonies, its distance meant that it lacked a sense of solidarity with those to its south. Thus, they saw themselves not as colonists, but as being entirely British, and most there believed that their problems would not be solved by political separation.
And this actually continued because Newfoundland was the last Canadian province to have joined Canada proper. Newfoundland joined in 1949 after the Second World War, as I already discussed previously, and so that's really interesting that's sort of one of the, maybe this had some sort of influence on that too.
There were two other important reasons for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland remaining loyal. The first was that the elites of the colonies hadn't lost any money from Britain's actions, like those in, say, Virginia or Massachusetts. They were mostly naval officers whose income came from their own lands back in Britain and whose position relied on loyalty. Reason number two was a simple one: proximity. It was quicker to sail to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia than any of the American colonies, meaning that any retaliation that did happen would have hit them first, and that was not a tantalising proposition for them. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you.
It's what it always comes down to, just taxes and money, no matter what. Okay, well, that was great. That was just 3 quick short videos on History Matters, just some brief Canadian history for you. If you like the video, let me know. I'm going to try and focus more on the things that I like. So the World War II, Canadian history, anything like that. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe, everything like that. Join the Discord. If you have any videos that you'd like me to react to, join the Discord, put them in the video suggestions box, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.